November 1944, Lieutenant Edward Schluter was hunting German night fighters at 10,000 feet over the Rhine Valley when his radar operator screamed. 8 glowing spheres had appeared on their wing, pacing them. Schluter banked hard. The lights matched him. He dove. They followed. He climbed. They stayed. For 14 minutes, these objects performed maneuvers that would kill any human pilot, while Schluter's instruments went haywire and his radio filled with static. When they finally vanished, his squadron commander told him to file no report. What Schluter saw that night would be seen by hundreds of Allied pilots over the next 6 months. British bombers over France, American fighters over Germany, reconnaissance planes over the North Sea, all reporting the same impossible phenomenon, glowing spheres that defied physics, ignored weapons fire, and seemed to watch. The military called them Foo Fighters. Pilots called them a nightmare. Intelligence officers couldn't explain them. The Germans were seeing them too, just as confused, just as terrified. These weren't secret weapons. They weren't experimental aircraft. They were something else entirely. And they had a pattern. They appeared near strategic targets, near weapons development facilities, near the heaviest fighting. And when the atomic age began in the summer of 1945, they didn't just observe anymore. They followed the bombs down. What happened in the skies over Europe and Japan between 1944 and 1945 remains one of the most documented and least explained phenomena in military history. Over 1,400 official sightings, thousands of witnesses, declassified files that raise more questions than they answer. This is their story. Before we dive into what happened next, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the night when everything changed. November 23rd, 1944. 22:47 hours. The Bristol Beaufighter cut through the cold night air at 10,000 feet, its twin engines drumming a steady rhythm that Lieutenant Edward Schluter had learned to trust. Below, the Rhine Valley stretched dark and silent, broken only by occasional flickers of distant artillery. The moon hung full and bright, turning the landscape below into a patchwork of silver and shadow. Perfect conditions for hunting, perfect conditions for being hunted. Schluter's mission was simple on paper: intercept German night fighters before they could reach Allied bomber streams returning from raids deep in the Reich. The 415th Night Fighter Squadron had been flying these missions for months, racking up kills against the Luftwaffe's increasingly desperate attempts to defend German airspace. Tonight should have been routine. In the seat behind him, Lieutenant Donald Myers hunched over the radar scope, watching the green sweep for contacts. The airborne interception radar was temperamental, prone to ghosts and glitches, but Myers had developed an instinct for reading it. In the observer's position, squeezed into the cramped fuselage, rode Lieutenant Fred Ringwald, an intelligence officer tagging along to observe operations firsthand. He'd been filing reports on enemy tactics and wanted to see combat from the pilot's perspective. He would get more than he bargained for. The air was clear, visibility unlimited. Strasbourg lay somewhere to the south, already captured by Allied forces, but still within range of V-2 rocket launch sites the Germans were using to terrorize cities across Europe. Every sortie over this region carried weight. The rockets were killing civilians by the hundreds, and tracking their launch facilities meant flying deep into contested airspace where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs prowled for easy kills. Schluter checked his instruments out of habit. Airspeed steady at 220 miles per hour. Altitude holding. Fuel sufficient for another 90 minutes of patrol. His hands rested light on the controls, feeling the aircraft respond to every minor adjustment. He'd flown 73 combat missions. He knew his aircraft. He knew this sky. He didn't know what was coming. Contact. Myers's voice crackled through the intercom, tense but controlled. 8 objects, bearing 270, range approximately 1 mile, at the same altitude. Schluter's pulse quickened. 8 aircraft in formation meant bombers or a fighter group. Either way, a significant engagement. Can you identify? Negative. The signatures are... They're not moving right. They're just holding positions. Schluter banked left, bringing the Beaufighter around to investigate. Through the canopy, he scanned the moonlit sky. Nothing yet. Ringwald, you seeing anything? From the back, Ringwald pressed his face to the observation window. Wait, yes. My God, yes. Schluter, you need to see this. Then he saw them. 8 glowing spheres, hanging in the night sky like lanterns suspended on invisible wire. Orange-red, each roughly the size of a basketball, arranged in a geometric pattern that looked deliberate, almost mathematical. They pulsed with steady luminescence, bright enough to cast faint shadows inside the cockpit. Schluter's first thought was flares. His second was some kind of German anti-aircraft weapon. But flares fell. These objects held position with absolute precision. Myers, confirm radar contact on those lights. I've got 8 contacts, Myers said, his voice climbing half an octave. But they're not moving like anything I've seen. The signature's all wrong. They're there, but they're not solid. Schluter's training kicked in. Unknown contacts in combat airspace meant potential threat. He pushed the throttles forward and banked hard right, putting the Beaufighter into a steep climbing turn designed to gain altitude advantage. The lights matched him, not followed, matched. They held the same geometric formation but shifted position to maintain their relative distance from his aircraft. No acceleration, no visible means of propulsion. They simply moved, as if the laws of inertia didn't apply to them. Schluter's mouth went dry. He rolled left, pulling 4 Gs in a maneuver that pressed him hard into his seat. The lights rolled with him, perfectly synchronized. They're staying with us, Ringwald said, his voice tight. Schluter, they're matching every move. I can see that, Schluter snapped. He shoved the stick forward, putting the Beaufighter into a dive that built speed rapidly. The airframe shuddered as they accelerated past 250 miles per hour. The lights descended with them, maintaining formation, no lag, no adjustment period. Just instant response. He pulled out of the dive and climbed again, the engines screaming. The lights climbed. He tried a series of random turns, sharp banks, altitude changes designed to shake any pursuer. The lights stayed locked on his wing. Jesus Christ, Myers breathed. They're not trying to intercept us. They're just watching. That's when the instruments started failing. The radio erupted with static, a harsh crackling that made Schluter wince and pull off his headset. The magnetic compass began spinning slowly, then faster, the needle whirling uselessly. The electrical systems flickered, lights dimming, gauges jumping. The radar scope washed out in interference. I'm getting massive electromagnetic distortion, Myers reported, fighting to keep his voice steady. I've lost the scope. I've lost navigation instruments. We're flying blind except for visual. Schluter looked out at the lights. They were closer now, perhaps 200 feet off his starboard wing. Close enough that he could see they weren't uniform. Each sphere had depth, layers of light that seemed to rotate within the outer glow. No exhaust trails, no engine noise over the roar of his own engines. No heat shimmer in the moonlight, nothing that belonged to any aircraft he'd ever seen or heard of. He tried one more maneuver, a violent snap roll followed by a power dive that would test the limits of the Beaufighter's airframe. The wings groaned under the stress, his vision grayed at the edges from the G-forces. The lights performed the same maneuver with him, instant acceleration, 90-degree turns at speed that should have torn apart any physical object. They moved as if mass and momentum were suggestions rather than laws. Schluter stopped trying to evade. His hands trembled on the controls. For 14 minutes, the lights maintained their formation, orbiting his aircraft in a slow, deliberate pattern. They weren't attacking. They weren't threatening. They were observing, studying, as if his Beaufighter was a specimen under glass. Then, without warning, they blinked out. Not faded, not accelerated away. Simply ceased to exist, all 8 simultaneously, as if someone had thrown a switch. One moment they were there, casting their orange glow across his wings. The next, only empty sky and moonlight remained. The radio static cleared. The compass needle steadied. The electrical system stabilized. Myers's shaky voice came through the intercom. "They're gone. Radar's clear. I've got nothing." Schluter realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to relax on the controls. "Ringwald, please tell me you saw that too." "Every second of it," Ringwald said quietly. "And I have no idea what the hell we just saw." They completed their patrol on autopilot, Schluter's mind replaying those 14 minutes over and over. When they finally touched down at their base in France, his legs felt weak climbing out of the cockpit. Ground crew noticed something was wrong. Pilots didn't return from routine patrols looking like they'd seen ghosts. Ringwald, the intelligence officer, went straight to file his report. He found Captain Harold Augsburger, their squadron commander, in the operations tent, bent over mission reports with a cigarette burning forgotten in an ashtray. "Sir, we need to report an encounter," Ringwald began. Augsburger looked up. His expression shifted immediately from tired routine to sharp attention. "You saw them too?" The question hung in the air like a bomb. "Two," Schluter said, entering behind Ringwald. "Sir, what do you mean two?" Augsburger stood, ground out his cigarette, and closed the tent flap. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "3 other crews in the past 2 weeks, same description. Glowing spheres, perfect formation, matching maneuvers. 2 from the 415th, 1 from the 416th Squadron down the line." "What are they?" Schluter demanded. "Some new German weapon? Rockets? Drones?" "We don't know." Augsburger looked at each of them in turn. "And that's the problem. Intelligence is looking into it, but right now we have no answers. None. The Germans should have used them against us by now if they were weapons. But they just watch and leave." "So what do we do?" Myers asked. "You keep it quiet," Augsburger said firmly. "No official report, no mess hall stories. We don't need panic spreading through the squadrons. Intelligence wants to handle this carefully." "Sir, with respect," Ringwald started. "That's an order, Lieutenant." Augsburger's tone left no room for argument. "I'll pass your encounter up the chain verbally, but nothing goes in writing until we understand what we're dealing with." But orders couldn't stop pilots from talking. By the next morning, word had spread through the squadron like fire through dry grass. In the mess hall, over terrible coffee and powdered eggs, the whispers started. Other pilots admitted they'd seen things too. Strange lights, objects that shouldn't exist. The nicknames emerged organically. Some called them Kraut fireballs, assuming German origin despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. Others picked up Foo Fighters from a popular comic strip character who always said, "Where there's Foo, there's fire." The name stuck. Within a week, the 415th, 416th, and 417th Night Fighter Squadrons were all reporting encounters. The pattern was undeniable. Always at night, always near enemy territory, always the same behavior. The objects never attacked, never fired weapons. They observed, paced, and vanished. Then the bomber crews started seeing them too. A B-17 pilot from the 8th Air Force, returning from a raid on Schweinfurt, reported 8 lights that followed his formation for 20 minutes. "We thought they were German night fighters," he told intelligence officers. "Then they started dancing around our formation. No airplane can move like that. They went from R6 to R12 in seconds. No turn radius, no acceleration time. They were just suddenly there." By December, the reports couldn't be contained anymore. Pilots from the 415th, the 416th, the 417th, all seeing the same impossible lights. But when intelligence finally sent the reports up the chain, something strange happened. The British had been seeing them too, for months. Over France, over Germany, over the North Sea. And they'd been ordered to stay silent. Someone high up already knew about these things. The question was, what were they so afraid pilots would discover? December 14, 1944. Wing Commander Nigel Tanner leveled his de Havilland Mosquito at 15,000 feet over Haguenau, France, and prepared to do something no pilot had ever been ordered to do before: deliberately seek contact with the unknown. He'd been briefed to expect them. His orders were simple: observe, evade if threatened, do not engage. What he wasn't told was that every pilot who got too close reported the same thing. The lights seemed to react to their thoughts. Tanner would test this claim himself, and what happened next would force Allied command to take the phenomenon seriously for the first time. But Tanner's mission didn't begin that December night. It began 2 months earlier, when the British realized they had a problem they couldn't ignore. October 1944. While American night fighters were just beginning their encounters over the Rhine, RAF pilots had already been seeing the lights for weeks. The 150 Squadron, flying missions over occupied France, filed report after report of glowing objects pacing their aircraft. Unlike the Americans, who were told to keep quiet, the British took a different approach. They investigated. The Air Ministry established a classified project, codenamed Massey, tasked with one objective: determine what these objects were and whether they posed a threat to Allied air operations. The fear was logical for 1944. The Germans had already surprised the world with V-1 buzz bombs and V-2 rockets. What if these lights were the next evolution? Advanced drones equipped with anti-radar technology, perhaps, or remotely piloted weapons waiting for the right moment to strike. But the reports didn't fit that theory. The objects never attacked. They observed, followed, and vanished. That behavior suggested reconnaissance, but reconnaissance for whom? Wing Commander Nigel Tanner was chosen to find out. At 32, he was a veteran of the Battle of Britain, a man who'd faced Messerschmitts over the Channel when Britain stood alone. He'd earned the Distinguished Flying Cross twice. He was calm under pressure, analytical, and most importantly, he didn't rattle easily. If anyone could approach these objects and gather intelligence without panicking, it was Tanner. His Mosquito had been specially equipped for the mission. Extra cameras mounted in the nose and wings. Calibrated instruments designed to measure electromagnetic fields, temperature variations, and radiation. A modified radio system with recording equipment to capture any signals the objects might emit. Even his flight suit contained a sensor array to monitor his own physical responses during the encounter. They were preparing to study the lights the way a scientist would study a new species. Carefully, methodically, with an understanding that this was no longer just a military question. It was a scientific one. Tanner took off from his base in eastern France just after sunset, climbing into clear December skies. His navigator, Flight Lieutenant James Whitmore, monitored the instruments while Tanner flew a search pattern over known encounter zones. They didn't have to wait long. "Contact," Whitmore said, his voice steady. "Visual bearing 340, altitude matching ours, range approximately 2 miles. Tanner turned and saw them immediately. 7 spheres, but different from the American reports. These were greenish-white with pulsing red cores, like hearts beating inside translucent shells. They hung in formation, not the geometric pattern Schluter had seen, but something more organic, almost fluid. "I'm going to approach," Tanner said calmly. "Document everything." He pushed the throttles forward, angling toward the lights. As he closed the distance, something remarkable happened. The lights maintained their separation, moving away at exactly the speed he approached. Not fleeing, adjusting, keeping a specific distance with mathematical precision. Tanner slowed. The lights slowed. He stopped closing and held position. The lights held position. They were responding to him. He remembered the briefing, the claims from other pilots that seemed too incredible to believe. "They react to intention," one American pilot had said, "like they know what you're thinking." Tanner decided to test it. He focused his mind, forming a clear thought. Come closer. One light separated from the formation. It advanced toward his aircraft, moving smoothly, deliberately. Tanner's pulse quickened, but he held his course. Whitmore, are you seeing this? Yes, sir. Whitmore's voice held a tremor he was trying to suppress. It's responding. Tanner thought, move left. The formation shifted left, all 7 objects moving in perfect synchronization, not following his aircraft, following his intention. My God, Whitmore breathed. Sir, they're responding to you. How is that possible? I don't know, Tanner said quietly. But we need to document it. He activated the wing cameras. Instantly, the lights flared brightly, their luminescence increasing tenfold. The sudden brilliance flooded the cockpit, washing out the film, ruining any chance of useful photography. When Tanner shut off the cameras, the lights dimmed back to their original intensity. They knew. Somehow, they knew when they were being recorded. Tanner brought his mosquito closer, edging forward meter by meter. The nearest sphere held its position until his wingtip was perhaps 10 feet away. At this range, he could see details no pilot had reported before. The glow wasn't uniform. Inside the outer luminescence, geometric patterns rotated slowly, crystalline structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his eyes could properly process. They shifted and reformed, creating shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if his brain couldn't quite interpret what it was seeing. He eased forward, extending his wing toward the object. The sphere moved away precisely 3 feet. He advanced again. It retreated 3 feet. Always the same distance, as if measuring by some invisible ruler. Then something strange, stranger than everything that had already happened. His instruments, unlike the American reports, showed no electromagnetic interference, no compass spin, no radio static, no electrical failures. His mosquito systems functioned perfectly. Whitmore, check your instruments. Any anomalies? Negative, sir. Everything's reading normal. It's as if they're not even there. But they were there. Tanner could see them, could almost feel their presence. A weight in the air that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the sense that something intelligent was on the other side of that glow, looking back at him. He held position for 8 more minutes, observing, noting details. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights accelerated away. Not gradually, instantaneously. They went from stationary to gone in a fraction of a second, leaving only empty sky, and the ghost of their glow burned into Tanner's retinas. He flew back to base in silence, his mind racing through what he'd experienced. Whitmore remained quiet too, processing the impossible. When they landed, Tanner filed the most detailed report of any Foo Fighter encounter to date. 17 pages, single-spaced, with attached instrument readings, photographic evidence, ruined though it was, and precise descriptions of the object's behavior. The report went directly to Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commander of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. What happened next would shape Allied policy on the phenomenon for the remainder of the war. Lee Mallory convened a classified analysis team. They compiled data from 47 separate encounters across RAF squadrons. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The objects never displayed hostility. In over 40 documented encounters, not once had they attacked or threatened Allied aircraft. Yet their performance characteristics were beyond anything 1944 technology could achieve. Radar tracking showed speeds exceeding 1,500 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of sound, decades before humanity would break that barrier. They performed 90-degree turns without deceleration, moves that would generate G-forces fatal to any human pilot. The analysis team developed 4 theories. Theory 1, German secret weapon. But this theory had fatal flaws. If the Germans possessed such technology, why use it only for observation? Why not weaponize it? Why let Allied bombers continue devastating German cities when these objects could clearly intercept them? Theory 2, Allied secret weapon. Perhaps American or British, so classified that even Allied forces didn't know about it. But cross-checking revealed no such program. The Americans were just as confused as the British. Theory 3, natural phenomenon. ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, atmospheric anomalies. But ball lightning doesn't maintain formation. It doesn't respond to human thought. It doesn't pace aircraft for extended periods with intelligent behavior. Theory 4 was listed in the original documents, but that section was redacted. Even 70 years later, when most files were declassified, those 3 pages remain blacked out. Whatever Theory 4 suggested, someone decided the public shouldn't know. On December 22, 1944, Allied intelligence held a joint conference in a secure facility in Paris. Representatives from US 8th Air Force, RAF Bomber Command, and Free French forces gathered to share data. Major William Leet, US Army Air Force Intelligence, presented the combined findings. 153 documented sightings across 3 air forces. The numbers were staggering, but more troubling was the pattern. Leet displayed a map of Europe with pins marking every sighting location. The clustering was unmistakable. Heavy concentration over strategic bombing targets. The Rhine Valley, Berlin, Schweinfurt. Multiple reports near V2 launch sites in the Netherlands and northern France. Significant activity around advanced German research facilities, particularly those rumored to be working on experimental weapons. But the most disturbing cluster was around locations that wouldn't be publicly known for another year. Sites connected to nuclear research, both Allied and Axis. A French intelligence officer raised his hand. "Major Leet, has anyone considered these objects might not be German at all?" The room fell silent. Every person there understood the implication of that question. If not German and not Allied, then what? Leet's response was measured. "That possibility has been discussed." Another uncomfortable silence followed. Finally, a British Air Commodore spoke up. "Gentlemen, regardless of origin, we need a unified policy. These objects have now been encountered by multiple Allied forces in broad daylight and at night. Sooner or later, the press will catch wind of this." The decision was made quickly. Continue observation, maintain absolute secrecy. Under no circumstances were pilots to engage the objects unless directly threatened. All reports would be classified as top secret and consolidated through intelligence channels only. They were preparing to contain a phenomenon they didn't understand, couldn't explain, and increasingly couldn't ignore. Back in the operational squadrons, bomber crews began reporting encounters too. Unlike night fighter pilots who saw the objects in darkness, B-17 and B-24 crews encountered them in full daylight over Germany. The added visibility revealed details that made the mystery deeper. In sunlight, the objects appeared metallic. Not glowing spheres, but solid craft with reflective surfaces. Bombardier Sam Mardis, flying in the lead aircraft of a bomber group over Mannheim, watched one pace his formation for 25 minutes. It was maybe 6 feet across, shaped like a disc, metallic silver. No wings, no exhaust, no visible means of propulsion. It just flew alongside us like it had all the time in the world. When the formation entered heavy flak over the target, the bomber crews expected the object to break off. Instead, it flew directly through the exploding shells, emerging on the other side completely unscathed. "Whatever they were," one pilot said later, "they could survive what we couldn't. Our bombers were getting torn apart by flak, and these things just flew through it like it wasn't even there." Gun cameras on multiple bombers captured footage, grainy black and white film showing disc-shaped objects maneuvering around formations. Most of this footage was immediately classified. Some leaked decades later, fueling post-war speculation about what exactly had been flying over Europe in 1944. Then intelligence officers made a discovery that changed everything. Captured Luftwaffe pilots, when interrogated about advanced German weapons, revealed something unexpected. They'd been seeing the objects too. The Germans called them Die Kugelblitz, ball lightning. Their pilots described identical encounters, glowing spheres, impossible maneuvers, observation without attack. German intelligence had been investigating just as intensely as the Allies, reaching the same dead ends. One captured German ace, when shown sketches of the objects based on Allied reports, laughed bitterly. "You think those are ours? We thought they were yours. They appeared after we bombed British cities. I was certain it was Churchill's revenge weapon, watching us, preparing to strike." The revelation was profound. The Germans were just as confused, just as frightened. These weren't German secret weapons. Theory 1 was dead. So what were they? By Christmas 1944, over 200 Allied and German pilots had witnessed the phenomenon. Both sides were investigating, both sides were baffled, and both sides were starting to realize they were dealing with something beyond the scope of the war they were fighting. But on December 27th, something changed. Captain Robert Taylor was piloting a B-24 Liberator on a bombing run over Cologne when 15 lights appeared around his aircraft. Unlike previous encounters, these objects didn't maintain distance. They closed in, forming a perfect spiral around the bomber, one light positioned at each point of the formation. Then they began to pulse in sequence, like lights chasing around a marquee. One pulse, then the next, creating a rotating pattern of illumination that bathed the entire aircraft in rhythmic light. Taylor's crew panicked. The ball turret gunner opened fire, his .50 caliber tracers passing harmlessly through the nearest object. The radio operator screamed that their communications were dead. The navigator's compass spun so fast it was just a blur. Taylor threw the bomber into violent evasive maneuvers, pushing the heavy aircraft to its limits. After 3 minutes that felt like hours, the lights suddenly released them, blinking out simultaneously. When they landed at their base in England, the flight engineer performed a routine inspection of the wings. He called Taylor over immediately, his face pale. Along both wings, arranged in perfect geometric patterns, were scorch marks. Not random burn damage from flak or fire, deliberate patterns. Circles, lines, and symbols that matched exactly the formation the lights had taken around the aircraft. The objects had touched them, and they'd left marks that looked disturbingly like writing. Someone high up immediately classified the bomber. The crew was debriefed for 8 hours, warned never to speak of what happened, and reassigned to different units. The aircraft itself was flown to a secure facility and never returned to service. The lights weren't just observing anymore, they were communicating. And Allied command had no idea what they were trying to say. January 1945, the lights were no longer content to watch. Over the Ardennes forest, during the brutal Battle of the Bulge, they began descending into the battlefield itself, appearing to ground troops, hovering over tank columns, and in one documented case, disabling an entire German artillery battery without firing a shot. General Patton's headquarters received 17 reports in a single week. His response was classified for 35 years. When it was finally declassified, the reason became clear. Patton believed they were targeting nuclear weapons development, and he might have been right. The first ground encounter happened on January 2, 1945, near Bastogne, where American forces were still locked in desperate fighting against the German offensive. Private First Class James Dawson and his squad had dug into frozen foxholes on the outskirts of the city, enduring sub-zero temperatures and constant artillery fire. They'd been holding their position for 3 days with minimal supplies, watching the tree line for German infantry that could attack at any moment. At 0340 hours, something appeared that made them forget about the Germans entirely. An orange sphere, roughly the size of a small car, descended silently from the clouds and stopped 50 feet above their position. It hung there, motionless, bathing the entire area in pulsating orange light. Dawson's first instinct was to take cover. Anything that bright was a target for every German gun in the sector. But the light didn't draw fire. It simply hovered, illuminating their foxholes, the frozen ground, the skeletal trees, everything within a 100-yard radius as bright as daylight. Then the ground began to vibrate, not shaking, not trembling, vibrating like a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. Dawson felt it through his boots, through the frozen earth, through his bones. His compass, hanging from his webbing, went berserk. The needle spun in wild circles, never settling, never finding north. One of his squad mates raised his rifle, finger on the trigger. "Don't," Dawson said quietly. He didn't know why he said it, didn't know why he was certain shooting would be a mistake, but the instinct was overwhelming. This wasn't an enemy. It was something else entirely. The object remained for 8 minutes. Long enough for every man in that squad to study it, to memorize its details, to understand they were seeing something that shouldn't exist. The glow wasn't uniform. It had depth, layers of light that seemed to rotate within the outer shell. And inside, barely visible through the luminescence, geometric patterns moved like living machinery. Then it shot straight up. No gradual acceleration, no engine roar. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, vanishing into the clouds faster than anything Dawson had ever seen. Faster than German rockets, faster than diving fighters, faster than seemed possible for any physical object. When it left, the vibrations stopped, the compasses settled, and 8 soldiers sat in their foxholes, staring at empty sky, trying to process what had just happened. Dawson reported the encounter to his lieutenant, who reported it to his captain, who sent it up the chain until it reached 3rd Army headquarters, where 17 similar reports were already waiting. The phenomenon was escalating. The lights weren't just following aircraft anymore. They were coming down to ground level, entering the battlefield itself. On January 8th, a British armor column near Liège had an encounter that would make the High Command take notice in ways previous reports hadn't. The column consisted of 12 Churchill tanks moving through rolling countryside, supporting infantry advances against retreating German forces. Weather was overcast, visibility moderate, typical winter conditions for the region. At 15:20 hours, the tank commanders spotted movement in the sky. Not aircraft, lights. More than 20 of them, descending in formation. They came down to treetop level and arranged themselves in a perfect grid pattern above the column. Not random, not chaotic, deliberately organized, like chess pieces on a board. Each light held position with mathematical precision, creating a lattice of illumination that covered the entire formation. Then every electrical system in every tank failed simultaneously. Radios went dead mid-transmission. Engine starters wouldn't engage. Battery-powered equipment ceased functioning. The tanks became 12 tons of immobile steel, sitting exposed in open terrain with German forces potentially nearby. The column commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Price, climbed out of his turret to assess the situation. What he saw would make it into his official report almost verbatim. The objects maintained perfect formation for approximately 15 minutes. No sound, no exhaust, no visible means of support. They appeared to be observing our vehicles with what I can only describe as methodical attention. The presence felt deliberate, controlled, intelligent. When the lights finally departed, ascending as rapidly as they'd appeared, the tank's electrical systems restarted immediately. Everything functioned normally, with one exception. Every chronometer in every tank was off by exactly 3 minutes. Not different amounts, not random variation. 3 minutes. As if time itself had been affected during the encounter, or as if 15 minutes had somehow compressed into 12. Price's report concluded with a statement that went against every military instinct. These objects demonstrated intelligent control. This cannot be explained as natural phenomenon, atmospheric anomaly, or conventional technology. Further investigation is urgently required. But the most disturbing incident came from the German side, discovered only after the war when captured documents were translated and analyzed. On January 12, 1945, a German artillery battery near Houffalize was preparing to fire on American positions. The battery consisted of 6 105mm howitzers, positioned to provide crucial support for German forces still fighting in the Ardennes. They had coordinates, they had ammunition, and they had orders to commence firing at 1800 hours. At 17:45 hours, 3 large lights appeared directly above the gun emplacements. These weren't the small spheres pilots had been reporting. According to the battery commander's after-action report, these objects were 3 to 4 meters in diameter, red-orange in color, and descended to within 20 meters of our position. What happened next was unprecedented. Every electrical system in the battery failed. Radios, rangefinders, battery-powered equipment, all dead. But more disturbing, the guns themselves wouldn't fire. Mechanical failures in the firing mechanisms, all 6 guns simultaneously. Soldiers attempted manual firing procedures, but the percussion caps wouldn't strike properly, as if some invisible force was interfering with the basic physics of the weapons. The lights remained for 30 minutes, hovering above the German position, while the crews frantically tried to make their guns operational. When the lights finally departed, the guns worked perfectly. But 47 soldiers reported severe headaches, nausea, and disorientation that lasted for hours. Some claimed temporary memory loss, unable to recall details of the encounter even minutes after it ended. The American position those guns were meant to target survived the night intact. The artillery fire that should have devastated them never came. Had the lights intervened deliberately? Had they prevented an attack? The German report didn't speculate, but the implication was inescapable. These objects weren't just observing warfare, they were interfering with it. When that report reached General George S. Patton's desk in late January, along with 16 others from American units reporting similar encounters, the general's response was characteristically direct. He wanted answers. Patton personally interviewed witnesses from multiple incidents: tank commanders who'd lost electrical power, infantry who'd seen lights hovering over German positions, pilots who'd encountered them at high altitude. He compiled the testimonies himself, cross-checking details, looking for patterns. On February 3, 1945, he wrote a classified memorandum that wouldn't be declassified until 1980. The language was stark. These phenomena show a clear pattern of appearing near advanced weapons development and strategic targets. Their behavior suggests reconnaissance capabilities far exceeding anything in the known arsenal of any combatant nation. I believe we are dealing with surveillance by an unknown force, possibly extraterrestrial in origin, with specific interest in our weapons development programs. Patton, who'd led armies across North Africa and Europe, who'd faced Rommel's Afrika Korps and Hitler's Wehrmacht, was suggesting something that would have seemed absurd to anyone who hadn't seen the evidence. Earth was being watched by something not of this Earth. He ordered an immediate report sent to General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces. He demanded cross-referencing with any similar phenomena reported in other theaters. And he insisted on knowing whether these objects had been seen near the most classified program in the American military, the Manhattan Project. The answer came back within a week. Yes, they had been seen, multiple times. Los Alamos, New Mexico, the secret facility where American scientists were racing to build the atomic bomb. Security logs from December 1944 through February 1945 documented 23 separate sightings of unusual aerial phenomena over the facility. The descriptions matched the European reports exactly: glowing spheres, impossible maneuvers, observation without hostility. Objects that appeared during critical tests, during major breakthroughs, during moments when the scientists were making progress toward unlocking atomic energy. Manhattan Project Director Leslie Groves, a man who didn't frighten easily, ordered a full investigation. Security was increased. Personnel were warned not to discuss the sightings. A classified bulletin went out to all facility staff. Report any unusual aerial activity immediately. Do not attempt to photograph or approach these phenomena. Maintain operational security at all times. But one physicist, whose name remains redacted in declassified documents, wrote a note in his personal journal that would later be discovered by historians. The objects appear during our most significant experiments. Yesterday, when we achieved sustained chain reaction in the test reactor, 3 lights appeared overhead within minutes. It's as if they know what we're doing, as if they're monitoring our progress. The question that haunts me, are they here to observe or to prevent? Intelligence officers began tracking global patterns. The lights had been reported not just at Los Alamos, but at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where uranium was being enriched, at Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was being produced, and, most disturbing, near suspected German nuclear research sites in Bavaria and Thuringia. Wherever humanity was working to split the atom, these objects appeared. The correlation was undeniable. On January 30th, 1945, Captain Lewis Walker had an encounter that would provide the most detailed footage of the phenomenon captured during the war. Walker was flying a solo reconnaissance mission over Bavaria in his P-51 Mustang, photographing potential targets for upcoming bomber raids. Weather was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for aerial photography. At 14,000 feet, a single object appeared off his port wing. It was larger than the typical reports, roughly twice the size of a beach ball, Walker estimated, and it came within 100 feet of his aircraft. Close enough that he could see details no pilot had reported before. The surface had texture, not smooth, not uniform, but patterned with what looked like panels or segments. Bands of light rotated within the outer glow, moving in opposite directions, creating a hypnotic effect. The object had depth, layers that seemed to extend inward farther than the external dimensions suggested, as if looking into it meant looking into something with more spatial dimensions than normal 3-dimensional space. His gun camera was running, capturing every moment on film. Walker tried standard evasive maneuvers. The object matched him perfectly, maintaining exact distance and relative position. He rolled, climbed, dove. It stayed locked on his wing as if connected by an invisible rod. After 5 minutes of this aerial dance, Walker had a realization. It wasn't chasing him, it was studying him. The way a scientist might study a specimen, observing how it moved, how it reacted, cataloging its capabilities. Then something changed. Walker pulled into a climb. The object didn't follow. It simply stopped dead in mid-air. He completed his climb and banked back to look. The object hung motionless at 14,000 feet, defying every law of aerodynamics. No aircraft could hover like that. No balloon could maintain perfect altitude in variable winds. It sat there in the sky as if suspended by invisible wires, impossible and undeniable. Walker watched through his gun sight. The object pulsed 3 times. Bright, dim, bright, dim, bright, dim, in a rhythm that felt deliberate, like a signal. Then it vanished. Not accelerated away, not dove or climbed. Simply ceased to exist in that location, as if someone had flipped a switch and turned off its presence in reality. Walker's gun camera captured the entire sequence. When the film was developed and analyzed by intelligence officers, it showed exactly what Walker described: an object that violated the laws of physics, demonstrated intelligent control, and disappeared in a manner that couldn't be explained by any known technology. The film was immediately classified. Walker was debriefed, ordered to silence, and reassigned. But copies of that footage survived, hidden in classified archives, waiting to be declassified decades later. By late January, Intelligence Officer Major Harold Dahl had compiled enough data to recognize the patterns everyone else was missing. Temporal pattern, sightings spiked before major military offensives. December's massive increase preceded the Battle of the Bulge. January's surge came before the planned Rhine crossings. It was as if the objects knew what was coming, as if they were positioning themselves to observe humanity's most violent moments. Spatial pattern, heavy clustering around nuclear research facilities on all sides, around strategic bomber bases where missions were planned against civilian targets, around V-2 launch sites where Germany's terror weapons were killing thousands, around areas of highest casualties where the death toll was greatest. Behavioral pattern, no hostility despite countless opportunities to attack. Only observation, with occasional interference, always interference that prevented weapons from functioning, never intervention that caused casualties. Dahl wrote a classified analysis that his superiors immediately suppressed. These objects demonstrate awareness of human conflict and possible intervention preference toward preventing escalation. Their behavior suggests concern with our weapons development, particularly nuclear capability. Recommendation: these phenomena should be treated as potential contact scenario requiring diplomatic rather than military response. The recommendation was ignored. The military didn't want diplomacy with something they couldn't understand or control. They wanted answers, and if necessary, they wanted weapons that could defend against this unknown force. By February 1945, the Foo Fighter phenomenon had evolved from curiosity to strategic concern. Allied command established Project Grudge, a classified investigation unit tasked with one goal: determine if these objects posed a threat to the war effort. What they discovered in March would change everything, because on March 15th, over Dresden, the city destroyed by firebombing 1 month earlier, the lights appeared in the hundreds. And for the first time, they didn't just observe. They descended into the ruins, where survivors reported seeing them move among the bodies, as if searching for something. When investigators reached the site 3 days later, they found evidence that would be immediately classified and remain buried for 40 years. Evidence that suggested these objects weren't just watching humanity's capacity for destruction. They were measuring it, recording it, and perhaps preparing for something else entirely. March 18, 1945. British intelligence officer Captain Michael Hartley arrived in Dresden with orders to investigate impossible reports. Hundreds of glowing spheres moving through the bombed city, apparently examining the dead. What Hartley found in the ruins would haunt him for the rest of his life. Physical evidence, radiation readings that shouldn't exist in 1945, and a pattern of burn marks on the ground that matched no known weapon. His report was classified top secret, eyes only, and sent directly to Churchill. It would not be declassified until 1985, and even then, 3 pages would remain redacted. The train journey from London had taken 36 hours, winding through liberated France and into occupied Germany. Hartley spent most of it reviewing the preliminary reports, reading them until the words blurred together. Each one said essentially the same thing. Something impossible was happening in Dresden, and it needed to stop before word spread beyond military channels. Dresden had been firebombed exactly 1 month earlier, on the night of February 13th to 15. Operation Thunderclap, they'd called it. RAF Bomber Command and the US 8th Air Force had turned the city into an inferno, creating firestorms so intense they generated their own weather systems. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 25,000. The city was still smoking when Hartley's train pulled into the outskirts. What struck him first was the smell. Not just smoke and ash, but something deeper. The scent of a city that had died in a single night. Buildings stood like hollow teeth against the sky, their interiors burned away, leaving only facades. Streets were unrecognizable, buried under rubble that rescue crews were still working to clear, still pulling bodies from the wreckage. Hartley wasn't here for the dead, though. He was here because of what had been seen over them. March 15th, exactly 1 month after the bombing, Allied reconnaissance flights over Dresden reported unusual activity. Multiple pilots radioed in sightings that made their commanders immediately classify the transmissions. Not the typical 5 to 15 objects that had become grimly routine in a Foo Fighter reports. Witnesses reported 200 or more lights moving in coordinated patterns across the ruined city. The behavior was different too. These lights weren't pacing aircraft or observing from altitude. They were descending into the city itself, moving methodically through the ruins at low altitude, sometimes dropping below building height entirely. Ground troops entering Dresden's outskirts reported the same phenomenon. Like someone turned on 1,000 light bulbs in the rubble, one sergeant had written. They were everywhere, moving slow, purposeful, like they were looking for something. Hartley's team consisted of 3 specialists he'd handpicked from available personnel. Lieutenant Davies, a radiological expert who'd been training for atomic warfare assessment, skills that were supposed to remain theoretical. Corporal Henderson, a surveyor with a mathematician's mind and an ability to see patterns in chaos. And Private Walsh, a photographer with steady hands and the security clearance to document things that officially didn't exist. They set up in what remained of a hotel on the city's eastern edge, close enough to the reported activity zones, but far enough that the structural damage wouldn't collapse on them while they slept. The first morning, Hartley began interviewing survivors. The German civilians still in Dresden were hollow-eyed, moving through the ruins like ghosts themselves. Many had lost everything: homes, families, any sense of normalcy. Hartley approached them carefully, using his limited German and a translator he'd brought from Allied command. He expected resistance, hostility from people whose city had been destroyed by his countrymen. Instead, he found witnesses eager to talk about something that frightened them more than the bombing itself. An elderly woman named Frau Kessler spoke through tears about the night of March 15th. She'd been living in a cellar with 6 other survivors, subsisting on whatever food they could scavenge. Around midnight, the cellar had suddenly flooded with orange light so bright it hurt to look at. She'd climbed the rubble to see the source. They were everywhere, she said, her hands trembling, moving through the streets like lanterns, but no one carried them. They floated. They moved slowly through the ruins, and they stopped at certain places. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. They stopped where bodies were buried. They knew. Somehow, they knew. Another survivor, a middle-aged man named Herr Brandt, described watching a light pause above the rubble pile where his wife had been buried. "I felt warmth," he said, "first warmth since the bombing. It was like it was acknowledging her. Acknowledging that someone had died there." The accounts were consistent despite the witnesses being separated during Hartley's interviews. The lights had appeared after midnight on March 15th. They'd moved in coordinated patterns through specific districts. They'd paused at locations that survivors identified as mass graves or sites where bodies remained buried. And they'd vanished before dawn, as suddenly as they'd appeared. Hartley's skepticism, the professional doubt that had kept him alive in intelligence work, was beginning to erode. The physical evidence was worse. Henderson, the surveyor, found them first. Burn marks in the rubble, circular scorch patterns ranging from 3 to 6 feet in diameter. At first glance, they could have been from the firebombing, but Henderson's trained eye caught the differences immediately. The composition was wrong. Firebombing created irregular burn patterns, scorching that followed fuel distribution and wind patterns. These marks were perfect circles, the edges precisely defined. Davies brought his equipment to the first site Henderson marked. The radiological specialist worked methodically, taking readings with a Geiger counter that had been cutting-edge technology just months earlier. When the counter began clicking rapidly, his face went pale. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm getting radiation." "From the firebombing?" Hartley asked. "No, sir. Wrong signature entirely. I don't know what this is. The pattern doesn't match conventional explosives. It doesn't match anything I've been trained to identify." Henderson mapped every burn mark they could find over the next 3 days. The pattern that emerged made Hartley's blood run cold. The marks weren't random. They formed a grid across specific districts of Dresden, districts that, when cross-referenced with civilian reports and military surveys, corresponded exactly to areas of highest casualties. The lights had been systematically scanning where the most people had died. Soil samples went back to a British military laboratory, location classified even from Hartley. The analysis came back within a week, marked urgent and classified beyond top secret. Hartley read the report 3 times, trying to comprehend what it was telling him. The soil showed exposure to intense electromagnetic fields far beyond anything conventional weapons could produce. Isotopes were present that the report's author noted should not be detectable with current technology. Their presence suggests exposure to energy levels we cannot yet generate. The molecular structure of the soil itself had been altered at the burn sites, rearranged at an atomic level. Dr. James Pemberton, the materials scientist who'd analyzed the samples, included a personal note that hadn't been cleared by his superiors. Captain Hartley, the energy required to produce these effects exceeds anything in our current arsenal, including theoretical atomic weapons. Whatever created these marks operates on principles we don't yet understand. I recommend immediate escalation to highest authority. But there was more. The most puzzling finding, plant matter at the burn sites showed accelerated growth. Where the lights had touched, life was returning faster. Seeds that should remain dormant in the March cold were sprouting. Grass was growing in patterns that radiated from the burn mark's centers. How could something that left radiation signatures also promote life? The contradiction made no sense. Hartley pushed deeper into his investigation. He interviewed Dr. Friedrich Weber, a German physician who'd been treating survivors in a makeshift clinic. Weber was initially reluctant to speak to a British officer, but his doctor's curiosity overcame his reticence when Hartley mentioned the lights. "My patients," Weber said carefully, "those who are near these phenomena, they report things that sound like trauma hallucinations. But the consistency troubles me. They describe temporary paralysis during exposure, a sensation of being scanned, as if something was looking through them, bright light and a feeling of weightlessness." "Physical symptoms?" Hartley asked. Weber nodded. "Burns that heal abnormally fast, no scarring, which is medically unusual for thermal injuries. And," he hesitated, "one patient, a young woman, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, 'It looked inside me. I know it sounds mad, but it looked inside. It saw everything I am.' Your medical opinion, doctor?" These people experienced something beyond trauma. Something happened to them physically. Something I cannot explain with current medical knowledge. The breakthrough came on March 24th when Hartley's team explored an intact basement in one of the scanned districts. The structure had survived the firebombing, and survivors reported seeing lights descend into it on March 15th. The basement walls showed scorch patterns unlike anything they'd seen before. Not random burn marks, but geometric shapes that resembled diagrams or schematics. Davies's radiation detector went wild, showing readings higher than any previous site. On one wall, burned into the stone itself, was a pattern that made Walsh's hands shake as he photographed it. Not painted, not carved, burned in with precision that suggested deliberate communication. The pattern resembled circuitry or mathematical equations rendered visually. Lines connected nodes in arrangements that looked almost like star charts or molecular diagrams. Hartley stared at it for 20 minutes, trying to understand what he was seeing. The pattern was intricate, complex, purposeful. Whatever had created this had wanted to leave a message. But for whom? When the photographs were developed and sent to British intelligence for analysis, the classification level was immediately upgraded to the highest tier. Post-war analysis, conducted years later by scientists with more advanced understanding, would note that portions of the pattern resembled electromagnetic theory that wouldn't be developed until the 1960s. The lights had left knowledge humans didn't yet possess, burned into stone in a devastated German city. Hartley compiled his report over 6 days, working 18-hour shifts, documenting everything. 47 pages of testimony, analysis, photographs, and conclusions that felt insane to write, but impossible to deny. His final assessment was stark. The objects observed over Dresden demonstrate intelligence and deliberate purpose, technology beyond current human capability by multiple generations, apparent interest in casualties and nuclear-level energy signatures, non-hostile intent despite presence in active war zone, possible attempt at communication through physical markings. Recommendation: further investigation essential. This phenomenon may represent a contact scenario requiring immediate attention at highest governmental levels. The report went directly to Churchill's office on April 2, 1945. The Prime Minister's handwritten note, declassified 40 years later, consisted of 3 sentences. Continue observation, maintain absolute secrecy, do not engage. All physical evidence Hartley had collected was seized within 24 hours. Soil samples, photographs, survey maps, everything disappeared into classified storage. The witnesses he'd interviewed were visited by security personnel and warned that discussion of the incidents could be treated as espionage. Hartley himself was ordered to destroy his personal notes. He kept a hidden copy. Years later, before his death in 1983, he would deposit it with a historian he trusted, with instructions to release it only after official declassification. That copy still exists in private archives, more detailed than the sanitized version the government eventually released. The official explanation went out to Allied commands in mid-April. Atmospheric phenomenon related to bombing conditions, no tactical significance. Pilots were instructed to file any future reports as unusual weather activity. The term Foo Fighter was actively discouraged in official communications. Intelligence officers who pressed for more investigation found themselves reassigned to different duties, their questions buried under mountains of bureaucracy. The military knew more than it was admitting, and some officers, realizing this, began keeping private records, personal journals, hidden reports, copies of documents that were supposed to be destroyed. They sensed they were witnessing something that history would demand to know about, even if their commanders wanted it forgotten. Hartley returned to London convinced he'd witnessed something that would rewrite human understanding of reality. He was wrong about one thing. He thought his report would trigger serious investigation. Instead, it triggered silence. Over the next 2 months, Foo Fighter reports declined dramatically across European theaters. Not because the sightings stopped, private journals and letters home suggest encounters continued, but because pilots were being ordered not to file them. The phenomenon that had generated 1,500 official reports over 6 months suddenly produced fewer than 20 in April and May combined. Then, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Foo Fighters should have disappeared with it. Combat had ended. Strategic targets no longer existed. There was no reason for reconnaissance, whether German, Allied, or otherwise. But they didn't disappear. They shifted. To the Pacific Theater, where the war continued. To the skies over Okinawa, where the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Campaign was reaching its apocalyptic conclusion. And most importantly, to the airspace around a small island called Tinian, where something was being prepared that would change human history forever. What happened in the Pacific Theater that summer would prove these objects weren't just observing our war. They were preparing for something else. July 16, 1945, at 5:29 a.m., the first atomic bomb detonated in the New Mexico desert. At 5:31 a.m., security personnel at the Los Alamos facility reported 9 luminous objects hovering at the edge of the mushroom cloud. They remained for 17 minutes, apparently studying the blast, then departed at speeds estimated at 7,000 miles per hour. 3 weeks later, as the Enola Gay approached Hiroshima with the second atomic weapon in history, her crew would encounter the same lights. This time, they wouldn't just observe. This time, they would follow the bomb down. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Within 72 hours, Foo Fighter reports over Europe dropped from dozens per week to fewer than 5. By June, European sightings had virtually ceased. Intelligence officers monitoring the phenomenon noted the decline with cautious relief. Perhaps whatever these things were, they'd been tied to the European conflict. Perhaps with Germany's defeat, they'd simply left. They hadn't left, they'd relocated. The Pacific Theater exploded with sightings. B-29 crews flying missions over Japan began reporting the same phenomena that had plagued European operations for 8 months. Glowing spheres pacing their formations. Objects performing impossible maneuvers. Electromagnetic interference that sent instruments haywire. But there was a pattern within the pattern, one that a sharp-eyed security officer named Major William Ioanna began to notice. The 509th Composite Group was experiencing encounters at a rate 3 times higher than any other bomber unit in the Pacific. The 509th was different from standard bomber groups. Their crews trained separately, flew special missions, and operated under security protocols that kept them isolated even from other Army Air Force personnel. Most military personnel didn't know what made them special, but Ioanna knew. He had the security clearance to know. The 509th Composite Group was preparing to drop the atomic bomb. Their training missions over the Pacific, practicing with dummy bombs that matched the weight and dimensions of the real weapons, were being paced by the same lights that had haunted Allied operations over Europe. Every practice run, every high-altitude formation flight, every simulated bombing approach. The lights were there. Ioanna compiled the reports in a classified memo dated July 10, 1945. His conclusion was carefully worded, but impossible to misinterpret. The correlation between 509th training operations and aerial phenomena encounters suggests these objects have specific interest in this unit's activities. Given the nature of the 509th's mission, this correlation warrants immediate attention. The memo went up the chain. Nothing came back down. No new orders, no investigation, no acknowledgement. Just silence, which told Ioanna everything he needed to know. Someone higher up already knew about the lights, and they'd decided to proceed anyway. 6 days later, the Trinity test proved why. The test site was in the Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man, a stretch of New Mexico desert so barren it looked like the surface of Mars. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, scientists detonated the first atomic weapon in human history. The explosion released energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, creating a fireball that reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. And they were not alone when they did it. Staff Sergeant Luis Gonzalez was stationed at a security checkpoint 12 miles from Ground Zero, equipped with welding glass to protect his eyes from the flash. When the bomb detonated, turning night into instant noon, he looked through the darkened glass at the rising fireball. That's when he saw them, 9 disc-shaped objects positioned at the edge of the mushroom cloud, perhaps 20 miles up. Not glowing spheres this time, solid craft, metallic, catching the light of the atomic fire. They held perfect formation despite the shockwave that was rattling buildings and knocking men off their feet 12 miles away. Gonzalez watched them through his welding glass for 17 minutes. They remained absolutely stationary, as if the laws of physics that governed everything else, air pressure, wind, gravity, simply didn't apply to them. Other security personnel saw them too. Guard posts up and down the perimeter called in reports that were immediately classified. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, was informed of the sightings within an hour. His response was never officially recorded, but a personal memo discovered in declassified archives decades later suggests he was already aware these objects existed. The memo, dated July 17th and addressed to General Leslie Groves, contained one cryptic line. The observers were present as anticipated. No interference occurred. The observers. Not unidentified objects, not phenomena. Observers, as if Oppenheimer knew exactly what they were and why they were there. His public statement after Trinity was equally cryptic. We knew the world would not be the same. Everyone assumed he was talking about the bomb, but that private memo suggests he might have been talking about something else entirely. About being watched while humanity crossed a threshold it could never uncross. The objects departed before recovery teams could mobilize, accelerating away at speeds that radar operators estimated at 7,000 miles per hour. They left no trace except the testimony of dozens of trained military personnel, all of whom were ordered to sign non-disclosure agreements and never speak of what they'd seen. But the lights weren't finished. The real test was still to come. Late July, Tinian Island. The 509th Composite Group had relocated to this tiny speck of land in the Pacific, 1,500 miles from Tokyo. From here, they would launch the missions that would end the war and introduce humanity to the atomic age. Navigator Theodore Dutch van Kirk, who would fly the Hiroshima mission, reported lights during practice runs throughout late July. The crew of the Enola Gay, the B-29 selected to carry the first combat atomic weapon, saw them repeatedly during training flights, always at high altitude, always when they were carrying the practice bombs that simulated the real thing's weight and dimensions. The lights knew. Somehow they knew which plane would carry the bomb and when. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th and pilot of the Enola Gay, filed an inquiry on July 28th. Request clarification on unidentified objects pacing training missions. Crew morale affected by repeated encounters. What are these things following us? The response came from intelligence. Maintain focus on mission objectives. Disregard aerial phenomena. Do not discuss with personnel outside security clearance. In other words, yes, we know about them. No, we're not telling you what they are, and we expect them to be there when you drop the real bomb. August 6, 1945, 02:45 hours. The Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian carrying Little Boy, a uranium-based atomic weapon with a yield of 15 kilotons. On board were 12 men who would witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The flight to Hiroshima took 6 hours. Weather was clear, visibility unlimited. Perfect conditions for the mission. At 07:45 hours, 1 hour before the scheduled bombing, Bombardier Thomas Ferriby spotted them through his bomb sight. 3 luminous spheres, pacing the bomber at 31,000 feet. They were different from the training runs, closer, brighter, more deliberately positioned, as if they knew this wasn't practice anymore. Ferriby called them out over the intercom. Every crew member looked, and every crew member saw them. Pilot Tibbets considered reporting them, but decided to maintain radio silence. Operational security for the mission was absolute. The lights maintained exact formation with the aircraft as they approached Hiroshima, not following from behind, not intercepting from ahead, flying parallel, equidistant, locked in position as if connected by invisible rods. At 08:15 hours and 17 seconds, Ferriby released Little Boy. The bomb fell for 43 seconds, and the lights followed it down. Tail gunner Bob Karen had the best view. Positioned in the rear observation blister, he watched through his gun sight as the 3 spheres descended with the weapon. They maintained perfect positioning around the falling bomb, 3 points of a triangle that held formation through the entire drop. I watched them through the scope, Karen would write decades later in his private journal. They stayed with it until detonation. Right up to the moment of the flash, they were there. At 08:16 hours, Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above Hiroshima. The explosion released the energy equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. The flash was visible from 300 miles away. The fireball reached temperatures of several million degrees. The shockwave destroyed 5 square miles of city in seconds. 70,000 people died instantly, and the lights were inside the blast. The Enola Gay, 12 miles away and climbing, felt the shockwave hit. 2 distinct jolts that the crew had been briefed to expect. Karen kept his eyes on the mushroom cloud rising behind them, watching the column of smoke and fire reach toward the stratosphere. Then the lights emerged. They came up through the mushroom cloud itself, rising from within the atomic fire like they'd been examining it from the inside. 3 spheres, still in formation, ascending rapidly. Karen tracked them through his sight until they accelerated beyond his ability to follow, disappearing into the upper atmosphere in seconds. When the Enola Gay landed back at Tinian, the crew was debriefed for 6 hours. They were specifically ordered not to mention the lights in any official reports or public statements. Karen's account of the bombing, published in newspapers worldwide, made no reference to the objects. But his private journal, released after his death in 1995, described the encounter in meticulous detail. The lights had followed the atomic bomb down. They had survived the detonation, and they had emerged from the fireball as if the most destructive weapon in human history couldn't touch them. 3 days later, it happened again. August 9, 1945. Boxcar, another B-29 from the 509th, approached Nagasaki carrying Fat Man, a plutonium-based weapon. The crew encountered 4 lights this time, one more than at Hiroshima. Same behavior, same impossible physics. They paced the bomber to the target, followed the bomb during its descent, and emerged from the mushroom cloud after detonation. The pattern was confirmed. These objects had specific interest in atomic weapons. Not conventional bombs, not incendiary raids, not strategic bombing. Only atomic detonations drew them this close, made them descend directly into the blast itself. Whatever they were measuring, whatever data they were collecting, it was worth entering the heart of an atomic explosion to obtain. Post-war, when the Japanese surrendered and their military records were captured, Allied intelligence discovered something that sent chills through everyone who read the reports. Japanese pilots had been seeing the same objects. Since 1944, Japanese air crews had reported encounters with what they called Tenshi no Tama, angel spheres. Glowing objects that paced their aircraft, performed impossible maneuvers, and seemed to watch rather than attack. Japanese naval intelligence had investigated, reaching the same conclusions as their Allied counterparts: unknown origin, advanced technology, non-hostile but unexplainable. The Japanese had assumed they were American secret weapons. The Americans had assumed they were Japanese or German. Now both sides realized neither controlled these things. They'd been watching everyone. Most disturbing was testimony from Dr. Yoshio Nishina, who had led Japan's atomic research program. He claimed that lights had appeared over their research facility in 1944 during critical experiments. The same pattern that had plagued Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford had occurred in Japan. Wherever humans worked to split the atom, these objects appeared, on all sides, as if they were monitoring humanity's progress toward nuclear capability, regardless of which nation achieved it first. September 1945, the war ended, but the investigation was just beginning. The military compiled every Foo Fighter report from the entire war. Project Sign, the first official investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena, reviewed 1,400 separate sightings spanning October 1944 through August 1945. The patterns were undeniable. The phenomenon began in force in October 1944, coinciding with the escalation of strategic bombing campaigns. Sightings clustered around nuclear research sites on all sides of the conflict. The objects appeared during both atomic bombings, following the weapons into the blast. They never attacked, despite countless opportunities. They interfered with weapons systems and electrical equipment, but never caused casualties directly. And they displayed technology decades, perhaps centuries, beyond 1945 capability. The official conclusion, released in 1947, unknown. The classified conclusion, leaked in the 1990s when elderly intelligence officers began speaking out. The extraterrestrial hypothesis cannot be dismissed. These objects demonstrated intelligent control, advanced technology, and specific interest in human nuclear capability. Their origin remains unknown, but their behavior suggests observation by non-human intelligence. For 40 years, that conclusion remained buried in classified archives. But the phenomenon didn't stop when the war ended. Throughout the Cold War, the same lights appeared at nuclear facilities worldwide. Soviet ICBM bases in the 1960s. American missile silos during the height of nuclear tensions. Chernobyl in 1986, hovering above the burning reactor. In 2004, declassified documents revealed that nuclear facilities in the United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China all continued reporting identical encounters with identical objects performing identical maneuvers. The pattern persisted for 80 years, still persists today. Whatever Edward Schluter encountered over the Rhine Valley in November 1944 didn't end with World War II. It evolved, adapted, followed humanity's most dangerous technology wherever it went. In the 1990s and early 2000s, journalists tracked down surviving Foo Fighter witnesses. The men who'd seen these objects firsthand, who'd been ordered to stay silent for decades, finally felt free to speak. Edward Schluter, who'd had the first documented encounter, died in 2006. His final interview was recorded 3 months before his death. "I know what I saw that night. It wasn't ours, wasn't German, wasn't anything human. It was watching us. And I think it's still watching us. We split the atom, we built weapons that could end civilization, and something out there took notice. That's what I believe. That's what I know." Bob Caron, tail gunner on the Enola Gay, died in 1995. His last public statement about Hiroshima: "Whatever those things were that followed the bomb down, they weren't surprised. They weren't curious in the way we'd be curious about something unexpected. They were interested, like they'd been waiting for us to do exactly what we did. That's what scares me most. Not that they were there, but that they expected it." Captain Nigel Tanner, the RAF pilot who deliberately sought contact with the lights, died in 1998. His final interview: "They responded to thoughts. That means consciousness, intelligence. We encountered something in 1944 that was aware of us in ways we still don't understand. They knew what we were thinking. They knew what we were doing. They knew what we were building. And they came to watch us use it. What does that say about them? What does that say about us?" Michael Hartley, who'd investigated Dresden, died in 2003. He kept his hidden notes for 58 years, finally releasing them shortly before his death. "I saw evidence in Dresden that these objects cared about casualties, not studied them scientifically, cared about them. The way they moved through those ruins, the way survivors described the warmth, the way life returned faster where they'd been. That has implications we haven't begun to process. If something that advanced cares about us, what does it want? And why didn't it stop us?" The questions remain unanswered. Why appear during humanity's most destructive war? Why focus specifically on nuclear weapons? Why never attack despite countless opportunities to eliminate humanity's emerging nuclear capability? What data were they collecting from the atomic blasts? Where did they come from? Where did they go when sightings declined after the war? And most importantly, are they still watching? In 1990, the British Ministry of Defence released the final Foo Fighter files. Among the thousands of pages was a memo from 1953 written by an unnamed Air Ministry official. It read, "After reviewing 8 years of data, we can conclude only that these objects demonstrated concern with human conflict and nuclear capability. Their behavior suggests monitoring rather than reconnaissance. We cannot determine their origin, their purpose, or their nature. We can only confirm they were real, they were intelligent, and they have not gone away. Vigilance is recommended." That same year, 6 F-16 pilots at a NATO base in Belgium encountered identical lights performing identical maneuvers over a nuclear weapons storage facility. The objects have never stopped appearing. We've just stopped talking about them. Every year, dozens of military pilots, American, Russian, British, Chinese, file reports of glowing spheres that pace their aircraft, interfere with their systems, and display impossible capabilities. These reports are immediately classified. Just like they were in 1944, whatever Edward Schluter encountered over the Rhine Valley that November night didn't end with the war. It's still out there, still watching, still waiting. And now that we've split the atom and reached for the stars, maybe we should start asking, what are they waiting for?